Previously on review.
While I can appreciate the idea of a game that expands on the base gameplay offered by Kung Fu, the execution in Karate Kid's not quite as good as Kung Fu, and it only makes me wish I was playing Kung Fu instead of Karate Kid. There are cheap and easy to find NES games that offer much more than this game does. Like Kung Fu! And so, my friends, it comes down to this. Kung Fu for the Nintendo Entertainment System, otherwise known as Kung Fu Master on other platforms, and also known in Japan as Spartan X. No, I'm not going there. Released in October of 1985, less than a year after the 1984 release of its arcade originator, Kung Fu is a common tale of a generic Kung Fu guy named Thomas, who must save his generic damsel in distress named Sylvia from the clutches of the generically named Mr. X. Or Mr. Cross, as the cool kids call him these days. Good God, that was so fucking stupid. I apologize for that, ladies and gentlemen. Let's move on. Anyway, you accomplish this objective by punching and kicking your way through 5 floors worth of generic-looking Kung Fu guys, as well as a bunch of nasty critters such as snakes, dragons, killer bees, and midgets. It's a fairly straightforward affair, there's not a whole lot to it, and it's not exactly extravagant in any way, shape, or form. Is this a bad thing? Absolutely not. As long as the game is fun to play and keeps you coming back for more, it really doesn't matter how simple or how complex the game is. And Kung Fu is certainly one of those fun titles that keeps you coming back for more every so often. The control scheme in Kung Fu is somewhat interesting, at least in comparison to other NES games released in 1985. Your face buttons are reserved for punching and kicking, which means you'll have to press up on the directional pad to jump. Although this might seem awkward, you'll quickly get used to it and becomes quite intuitive. It probably helps that there's very little to no platforming elements to be found in Kung Fu, so jumping in this game is used mostly to avoid attacks and delivering some aerial strikes rather than trying to jump over a lousy pit and failing miserably at it. And while your arsenal of attacks is fairly limited, there's no special moves or anything of the sort to be found here. At the very least, they execute swiftly and easily, as Kung Fu's controls are tight, responsive, and very easy to get into. Now, 5 levels of play doesn't seem like much. In fact, it really isn't. Each level is just moving from start to finish, knocking out bad guys until you reach the boss. There's no real variety in the levels outside of the enemies you get to fight. It's just the same hallway over and over again, and yet Kung Fu doesn't lay on its laurels. While level layout is practically the same, the enemies you face on each level kinda sorta vary. For example, you start off level 1 fighting your regular grunts, and then the next level has you fighting snakes and dragons. Eventually you'll be fighting midgets and bees as well, so there's some variety in who you fight. And the bosses are no pushovers either, some bearing weapons of mass destruction to make life a little less pleasant, shall we say. Make no mistake, Kung Fu is a fairly challenging game that relies on quick reflexes and refined skill to truly master the 5 levels featured here. And if you fancy yourself someone who wants a little more challenge, there's Game B, which is somewhat harder, I guess. Graphics on Kung Fu are fairly colorful and of decent quality. The sprites are quite large and move about quickly and smoothly despite only comprising a few frames of animation total. Scrolling is quite smooth, which isn't a huge thing, but it's a detail that I've noticed some NES games having a tendency to mess up pretty badly, despite being a fairly common feature in the great majority of NES games. Level design seems to be the only weak spot in Kung Fu, as the hallway is fairly bland looking and even seems to have some fewer details than the arcade original. Details, mind you, that made their way to the Atari 7800 version of the game. But anyways, aside from that, Kung Fu looks good enough. Not great, but not bad. Sound, however, is probably Kung Fu's strongest point. There's a couple jingles here and there that really set the tone for the game, along with a familiar background jingle that plays throughout gameplay. They're all pleasing to the ears, mind you. There's actually quite a few digitized voice samples in the game that really adds to the overall atmosphere of Kung Fu, and while not clear sounding obviously, they still sound pretty decent for the most part. For the most part, Kung Fu is generally considered to be something of a classic in some circles, often cited as being the originator of the beat-em-up genre of video game. I find that to be untrue, since you're not really beating up on anybody so much as you're not just knocking them off the screen for the most part. It doesn't take a whole lot of your time, it's fairly short, there's not a whole lot to it, and it probably won't keep you enthralled for long periods of time, but Kung Fu is a rather enjoyable game that you could pop in every so often, kill a few minutes, and pop right out. It's fairly easy to get into, it's straightforward, it's almost cathartic release after a long day, and it's a fun game to boot. It's also pretty cheap and easy to find, which is a good thing. This is one worth checking out if you're looking for a quick and easy game to kill some time, but if you're looking something a little more involved, then Kung Fu is not the best choice for you.